You wake up feeling strange, like something is slightly off, but you can't explain why. Your thoughts don't feel as clear, and your memory seems fragmented in ways that don't make sense. A doctor tells you it's part of treatment, something designed to help you recover. You trust the process because everything looks professional, controlled, and safe. Days pass, and you begin to notice gaps in your memory. Conversations you don't remember, actions you don't recall, decisions that don't feel like your own. The environment feels normal, but your perception of it starts to shift. Something is changing, and you cannot tell whether it is happening around you or inside your mind. You try to hold on to what feels real, but even that becomes uncertain. The more you question it, the harder it becomes to trust your own thoughts. What if the problem isn't confusion, but influence? What if your reactions are being studied, your responses observed, and your mind treated as something that can be adjusted? For years, this sounded like fiction, something imagined, exaggerated, or misunderstood. But documents later revealed that a program existed, and it was far more structured than people believed. This is the story of MK-Ultra, a program connected to CIA that explored the limits of human perception, behavior, and control. And the most unsettling part is not that it happened, but that only part of the story was ever fully revealed. In the early 1950s, during a period shaped by rising global tension, intelligence agencies began expanding their focus beyond traditional surveillance and information gathering, toward understanding how human behavior could be influenced under controlled conditions. Within the CIA, discussions emerged around whether perception, memory, and decision-making could be affected in ways that were not immediately visible to the individual experiencing them, creating a new area of strategic interest. This shift led to the development of a program that would later become known as MK-Ultra, a series of interconnected projects designed to explore how external factors could alter internal responses without being recognized as interference. One of the central figures involved in coordinating these efforts was Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist whose role combined research oversight with the organization of experiments across multiple locations. The structure of the program was intentionally fragmented, with different sub-projects operating independently, often under separate names, making it difficult to identify the full scope of activity as a single coordinated effort. Research associated with the program was conducted in universities, hospitals, and specialized institutions, frequently presented as legitimate studies, allowing participation without full awareness of the broader context. At locations such as the Allen Memorial Institute, experiments led by Donald Ewan Cameron focused on understanding how memory and behavioral patterns could be influenced through controlled conditions. During this time, these activities were not publicly known, and even within professional communities, information about the program was limited, with oversight distributed across different levels. The assumption that such research remained contained within controlled environments contributed to a sense of distance between the experiments and their broader implications, reinforcing the idea that these were isolated. However, as records later revealed, the program extended further than initially understood, involving multiple disciplines and approaches aimed at exploring the limits of human perception and response. In the early 1970s, a significant portion of documentation connected to the program was intentionally destroyed, leaving only partial records available for future investigation and analysis. This absence of complete information created uncertainty around what had been fully tested, what had been discontinued, and what remained undocumented, making the history of MK-Ultra both partially known and partially unresolved. What is known today is based on fragments, testimonies, and surviving files, forming a picture that suggests a program far more complex than originally assumed, with implications that continue to be examined. And it is within those missing pieces, the parts that were never fully preserved, that many of the most important questions about the program still remain unanswered. As the program developed, its structure expanded into a network of sub-projects that operated across different institutions, making it difficult to track how individual studies were connected to a larger objective. Within these environments, research focused on how external stimuli could influence perception, memory, and behavior, often under conditions that were carefully controlled but not always fully explained to participants. Many of these studies were presented as legitimate medical or psychological research, creating a context in which individuals believed they were contributing to scientific progress without understanding the broader framework behind the work. The coordination of these efforts, under figures such as Sidney Gottlieb, brought together multiple disciplines, including chemistry, psychology, and behavioral science, forming an approach that was both systematic and highly compartmentalized. At institutions like the Allen Memorial Institute, research led by Donald Ewan Cameron explored methods aimed at understanding how memory patterns could be altered and how responses could be influenced over time. These experiments often involved extended observation, where participants were monitored to identify gradual changes in behavior, reactions, and cognitive responses under varying conditions. In some cases, substances were introduced as part of the research, with the intention of studying how altered states could affect perception and the processing of information, adding another layer of complexity to the experiments. What made these methods difficult to evaluate later was not only the nature of the experiments themselves, but the way documentation was handled, as many records were incomplete or later removed. The fragmented structure of the program meant that no single overview existed at the time, allowing individual projects to continue without a clear understanding of how they contributed to the overall objective. As information began to surface in later years, it became evident that the program was not limited to a specific type of research, but rather explored a wide range of approaches aimed at influencing human behavior under controlled conditions. This realization shifted how the program was perceived, transforming it from a series of isolated studies into a coordinated effort that extended beyond what had initially been assumed. And yet, even with the information that became available, the absence of complete records left critical gaps, ensuring that the full extent of what was tested remains only partially understood. For many participants, the experience did not begin with anything unusual. The environment felt controlled, structured, and familiar, often presented as part of a treatment or a standard research process that did not raise immediate concern. Instructions were given calmly, procedures followed a routine pattern, and the setting reinforced a sense of trust. Nothing appeared out of place, which made it easier for individuals to accept what was happening without questioning it in detail. Over time, however, subtle changes began to emerge. Memory became less reliable. Reactions felt delayed or unfamiliar, and thoughts that once felt clear started to lose their consistency in ways that were difficult to describe. Participants often struggled to identify when these changes began, because the transition was gradual. What initially felt like fatigue or confusion slowly developed into something more persistent and harder to ignore. In environments associated with the program, including locations like the Allen Memorial Institute, observations were recorded to track how individuals responded under these shifting conditions. Research linked to figures such as Donald Ewan Cameron focused on how patterns of thought could be influenced, with attention given to repetition, reinforcement, and the interruption of existing behavioral structures. From the outside, these processes appeared structured and controlled. But from the perspective of those experiencing them, the situation often felt increasingly uncertain, as familiar reference points became harder to rely on. The difficulty was not only in what was happening, but in recognizing that it was happening at all. When perception itself begins to shift, the ability to evaluate that shift becomes limited. This created a situation where individuals could sense that something was different, but could not clearly define what had changed or why it was happening, leaving them dependent on the explanations provided within the environment. As a result, trust became both a stabilizing factor and a limitation, because the same system that provided reassurance also shaped how the experience was interpreted. Over time, the gap between what was felt and what was explained began to widen, creating a form of uncertainty that was not easily resolved through observation alone. And in that space, where perception, memory, and explanation no longer aligned, the experience itself became difficult to separate from the system that defined it. At first, the irregularities did not appear significant enough to raise immediate concern. Small inconsistencies were often interpreted as normal variations, something expected in complex environments where human behavior is not always predictable. Participants reported moments of confusion, difficulty recalling recent events, and a growing sense that their thoughts did not fully belong to them. These experiences were subtle, often dismissed as stress or fatigue, rather than something more structured. In controlled settings, observations continued, and data was collected on how individuals responded to these changes over time. What made these patterns difficult to interpret was their gradual nature, making it hard to define a clear starting point. Outside of these environments, similar accounts began to surface, but they were fragmented and lacked context. Without a clear framework, these experiences were not immediately connected to a larger process. Investigations that took place years later revealed that some participants had been exposed to conditions that influenced their perception without their full awareness, raising questions about how consent and understanding were managed. The absence of complete documentation made it difficult to reconstruct timelines, but surviving records indicated that certain methods were applied repeatedly, suggesting a structured approach rather than isolated incidents. As more information became available, researchers and investigators began to identify patterns that pointed toward coordinated experimentation, rather than unrelated events occurring independently. The realization that these patterns extended across different locations and contexts shifted how the program was understood, revealing a level of organization that had not been fully recognized before. What had once been seen as individual cases started to form a broader picture, where similar methods and outcomes appeared across multiple studies, connected by a shared objective. This shift in understanding did not immediately provide clear answers, but it changed the nature of the questions, moving from what happened in isolated cases to how far the program extended. And with that shift came a deeper uncertainty, because the more connections were identified, the clearer it became that not everything had been documented, and not everything could be verified. When documents began to surface, the picture became clearer, not because everything was revealed, but because enough details remained to understand what was actually being tested inside these environments. Participants were often placed in controlled settings, where their reactions were carefully observed over time, with attention focused on how perception, memory, and behavior changed under specific conditions. In some cases, substances were introduced as part of the research, not always with full explanation, allowing researchers to study how awareness shifted and how individuals responded when their perception of reality began to change. What made this difficult to recognize was that the environment itself appeared structured and professional, reinforcing the idea that everything was part of a legitimate process, rather than something designed to influence behavior. Other methods relied on repetition and controlled exposure, where participants were subjected to patterns of stimuli intended to affect how information was processed and how responses were formed over time. These processes were not always immediate in their effects. Instead, they worked gradually, making it harder for individuals to identify when changes began or to separate their own thoughts from external influence. In certain documented cases, memory became fragmented, with participants struggling to recall events or distinguish between what had happened and what they believed had happened. At the same time, observations continued, with researchers documenting behavioral shifts, emotional responses, and changes in decision-making under these conditions. What makes these records significant is not only what they describe, but how they describe it, presenting these methods as structured experiments rather than isolated incidents. Even with incomplete documentation, the consistency across different reports suggests that these were not random tests, but part of a coordinated effort to understand how human perception could be influenced. And while the full extent of what was done remains unclear, the details that are available point to a program that was far more deliberate and complex than it was initially assumed. By the mid-1970s, fragments of information began to surface, not as a complete narrative, but as scattered pieces that pointed toward a program few outside of intelligence circles had ever heard about. Investigations were initiated, and hearings held in the United States Senate began to examine activities connected to intelligence operations, including programs that had operated without full public awareness for years. The work of the Church Committee brought attention to projects that had previously remained classified, revealing that certain experiments had been conducted under conditions that raised serious ethical and legal questions. What made these findings difficult to interpret was the absence of a complete record. Shortly before these investigations, a significant number of documents related to MK Ultra had been destroyed, removing large portions of the program's history. The remaining files, however, provided enough detail to confirm that the program had existed as a structured and coordinated effort involving multiple institutions, disciplines, and methods over an extended period. Testimonies and surviving records described research that went beyond theoretical exploration, showing that practical experiments had been carried out in environments that participants often believed to be safe and controlled. As more information became public, the understanding of MK Ultra shifted from speculation to documented reality, though that reality remained incomplete due to the missing records. The absence of those documents created a lasting uncertainty, because what is known is based on what remained, while what was removed continues to shape the boundaries of what can be understood. This is what makes the story difficult to close, because it does not end with a clear conclusion or a complete explanation of everything that took place. Instead, it ends with partial answers, confirmed details, and a recognition that the full extent of the program was never fully preserved. And that realization changes the nature of the story, because it is no longer only about what was done, but about what cannot be fully reconstructed. In the end, MK Ultra is remembered not only for the experiments that were documented, but for the gaps that remain, the missing pieces that continue to raise questions long after the program itself was brought to light. Today, the systems people trust are more advanced than ever, managing information, decisions, and environments in ways that are rarely questioned as long as everything appears to function normally. The story of MK Ultra is often seen as something from the past, a program connected to a specific time, shaped by conditions that no longer exist in the same form. But the core idea behind it was never limited to a single program. It was about understanding how perception works, how behavior can be influenced, and how people respond when they believe they are in control. What makes this difficult to dismiss is not only what was documented, but what was never fully preserved, because the absence of complete records leaves open questions that cannot be answered with certainty. Over time, technology has changed, systems have evolved, and the scale at which information is processed has increased beyond what was possible in earlier decades. And yet the same principle remains, because when people trust what they see without questioning it, that trust becomes the foundation of how reality is understood. If perception can be influenced, even slightly, then the way people interpret their environment can change without immediate recognition. That idea is not limited to one place, one time, or one program. It exists wherever systems, information, and human perception intersect. The story does not end with the release of documents or the conclusion of investigations. It continues in the questions that remain, in the gaps that were never filled, and in the understanding that not everything was meant to be fully revealed. And the most unsettling part is not what is already known, but how easily something can exist within a system without being recognized, as long as everything continues to appear normal.